The sound of brass hitting concrete echoed through the firing range like fallen pennies, each casing a small rebellion against the suffocating silence that had followed. Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez stood motionless, her M4 carbine still. Warm in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel like incense in a chapel of violence. 14 perfect holes dotted the target downrange. A constellation of precision that had just rewritten the rules of Camp Leatherneck's morning qualification. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Commander Bradley Bull Morrison's face had gone the color of desert camouflage in a sandstorm. His meaty fingers, still tingling from where Maria had twisted his wrist with the fluid efficiency of an Aikido master, flexed and unflexed as he stared at the target. The paper silhouette hung there like evidence in a courtroom, each bullet hole. A testimony to something he couldn't quite name, but definitely couldn't ignore. "Impossible," he muttered, the word escaping his lips like air from a punctured tire. The range had fallen silent around them, 47 Marines frozen in various states of loading, aiming, and breathing. Even the Afghan wind seemed to hold its breath. Maria lowered her weapon with the same deliberate care she used when handling her grandmother's rosary beads. Her dark eyes, flecked with amber like desert glass, never left Morrison's face. She could feel the weight of every stare, every held breath, every question that hung in the air, thicker than the cordite smoke. But what she felt most acutely was the ghost of her father's calloused hand on her shoulder, the memory of his voice saying, "Mia, sometimes the only way to earn respect is to take it." The firing range at Camp Leatherneck stretched like a concrete altar beneath the merciless Afghan sun. Built in 2009 by a construction crew from Alabama who'd complained about the heat until they met their first AED, the range had witnessed thousands of qualification rounds, countless competitions, and more than a few heated arguments between Marines who thought they could shoot and Marines who actually could. The backstop, a mountain of sand and gravel that had absorbed more lead than a Flint water pipe, bore the scars of 7 years of military precision and military ego. This morning had started like any other qualification day. The air tasted of dust and diesel fuel, seasoned with the particular tang of nervous sweat that came before any test that could affect a Marine's career. Maria had arrived early, as was her custom, to inspect her rifle and settle into the rhythm of controlled breathing that had served her well through 3 deployments. Her M4, serial number etched into her memory like a prayer, had been meticulously cleaned the night before. Each component had been examined, oiled, and assembled with the kind of attention usually reserved for diffusing explosives. She'd drawn her ammunition 30 rounds of Lake City M855 ball ammunition from Corporal Numbers Rodriguez, a logistics specialist from Tucson who counted everything twice and still worried he'd miscounted. Numbers had watched her sign for the rounds with his usual nervous energy, his pen clicking against the clipboard like a metallic heartbeat. "Good luck out there, Staff Sergeant," he'd said, not knowing he was witnessing the prelude to a legend. Qualification course was standard Marine Corps doctrine. 20 rounds from the standing position, 10 from kneeling. Each shot had to count, each breath had to be controlled. Each trigger pull had to be a conversation between intention and execution, mediated by years of training and the particular alchemy that transformed lead into reputation. Maria had been halfway through her standing portion when Commander Morrison appeared. Bull Morrison, he'd earned the nickname not for any bovine characteristics, but for his tendency to charge headfirst into situations that required finesse. Had been prowling the firing line like a territorial animal marking his domain at 6'3", and carrying the kind of muscle that came from a youth spent wrestling steers on his family's Oklahoma ranch. Morrison commanded attention through presence alone. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots mirror bright, His jaw set at the kind of angle that suggested he'd spent considerable time practicing intimidation in mirrors. But it wasn't his size that made Marines nervous. It was his eyes, pale, blue and calculating, like a predator evaluating potential prey. Those eyes had been trained on Maria from the moment she'd taken her position, studying her stance with the kind of intensity usually reserved for enemy positions. "Vasquez," his voice had cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "Step aside." The words hung there between them, a gauntlet thrown down on sand and concrete. Around them, the other Marines continued their qualifications, but Maria could feel their attention shifting like iron filings drawn to a magnet. She'd looked up from her rifle sight, meeting Morrison's gaze with the steady calm that had carried her through firefights in Helmand Province and heated arguments with supply sergeants who thought women belonged anywhere but the front lines. "Sir, I'm in the middle of my qualification," she'd replied, her voice carrying the particular mix of respect and steel that effective NCOs learn to wield like a surgical instrument. "I have 6 rounds remaining in this relay." Morrison had stepped closer then, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the starch in his uniform, close enough that his shadow fell across her shooting position like a storm cloud blocking the sun. "I said step aside, Staff Sergeant. There's been some question about the scoring down at Target 14. I need to verify the rifle's accuracy." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Maria's target, visible even at 300 meters, showed a tight grouping that would make a precision rifle jealous. Every shot had found its mark with the kind of consistency that turned range instructors into believers and skeptics into converts. But Morrison wasn't interested in accuracy. He was interested in making a point. The point being that he was the commander, she was the subordinate, and the natural order of things dictated that she step aside when he demanded it. Maria had felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same flame that had driven her to enlist despite her family's protests, that had pushed her through the crucible of infantry school when her male classmates whispered she wouldn't make it, that had carried her through 3 combat deployments while politicians debated whether women belonged in combat roles. It was the fire of every woman who'd ever been told she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or good enough, and had proven otherwise through blood, sweat, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations imposed by other people's fears. "Sir," she'd said, her voice now carrying an edge sharp enough to cut glass, "my qualification is not complete. Marine Corps Order 3574.2K specifically states that a Marine may not be interrupted during qualification fire unless there is an imminent safety concern." She'd paused, letting the regulation hang in the air between them like a challenge. "Is there a safety concern, sir?" Morrison's face had flushed red above his collar, the color creeping up his neck like spilled paint. Around them, the firing line had gone quiet as Marines sensed the electrical charge building in the air. Even the range safety officer, Gunnery Sergeant Patricia "Iron" Murphy, had turned to watch the confrontation unfold with the kind of attention usually reserved for incoming mortar. "Hand me the rifle, Staff Sergeant," Morrison had said, his voice dropping to the low growl that preceded most of his explosive outbursts. "That's an order." And that's when Maria had made the decision that would echo through the rest of her career and ripple outward into the lives of every Marine watching. She'd looked down at her M4, at the weapon that had saved her life in a Kabul marketplace when Taliban fighters had tried to turn a routine patrol into an ambush. The rifle that had put rounds precisely where they needed to go when the lives of her squad depended on her ability to shoot straight under pressure. The weapon that represented not just her qualification, but her identity as a Marine who'd earned her place through merit, not politics. She'd extended the rifle toward Morrison, barrel pointed safely downrange, her grip loose and compliant. For a moment, it seemed like the confrontation would end with her capitulation. Another small victory for the forces that believed rank trumped right, that authority mattered more than fairness. but as Morrison reached for the rifle, his hand, closing around the foregrip with the possessive grip of someone claiming territory, Maria had moved. The Aikido technique was called katagasiya, wrist twist that redirected an opponent's energy against themselves. Maria's sensei, an elderly Japanese woman who taught classes above a used bookstore in 29 Palms, had drilled the movement until it became as natural as breathing. The stronger they grip, Sensei Tanaka had said, the easier they fall. Morrison was gripping very strongly. Maria's left hand had closed over Morrison's wrist like a steel trap, her thumb finding the precise pressure point that made his fingers spasm involuntarily. Her right hand had moved to his elbow, and then she'd simply turned a pivot that used Morrison's own momentum and body weight against him. The commander, all 6'3" and 240 pounds of him, had found himself bent at an impossible angle, his wrist twisted in a way that made resistance not just futile but agonizing. "Sir," Maria had said in the same calm voice she might use to discuss the weather, "you're creating an unsafe condition on my firing line. I need you to step back." The entire range had watched in stunned silence as Bull Morrison, the man who'd once arm wrestled, a Navy SEAL to a standstill, who'd earned his commission by being tougher and meaner than everyone around him, was controlled completely by a 5'6" staff sergeant who probably weighed 100 pounds less than him. Morrison had stepped back, his face cycling through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that suggested either rage or a cardiac event. Maria had released his wrist and immediately returned to her firing position, settling behind her rifle as if nothing unusual had just occurred. 6 rounds remaining, sir," she'd said conversationally. "Would you like to observe from the designated viewing area?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Maria chambering around and adjusting her breathing. Down at target 14, the paper silhouette waited patiently for its final punishment. The wind gauge barely trembled in the morning. Stillness. Maria's first shot after the confrontation had struck dead center, expanding the ragged hole she'd been building with mechanical precision. The sound of the shot seemed louder somehow, as if the entire base was listening. Her second shot joined the first, the impact visible even at distance as another small victory against doubt. By the fourth shot, Marines from other firing positions had begun to notice something extraordinary was happening. Word spread through the firing line with the speed of military gossip. Staff Sergeant Vasquez was shooting the kind of group that belonged in marksmanship competitions, not routine qualifications. By the sixth and final shot, even the range safety officer was leaning forward, binoculars trained on target 14. When the ceasefire whistle blew and the targets were brought forward for scoring, the paper told a story that would be retold in barracks and mess halls for years to come. 14 shots, 14 hits, all within a space smaller than a playing card. The kind of precision that transformed skeptics into believers and turned a routine qualification into legend. Morrison had stared at that target for a full minute, his jaw working like he was chewing on something particularly bitter around him. Marines were already calculating what they'd witnessed, not just the shooting, but the confrontation that preceded it. The way a staff sergeant had stood her ground against a commander, had used his own aggression against him, and had then proceeded to demonstrate exactly why she deserved to hold that rifle. Gunnery Sergeant Murphy had approached with the measured stride of someone who'd seen enough military drama to fill several novels. Iron Murphy had earned her nickname during her second deployment to Iraq, when she'd continued returning fire despite taking shrapnel in her shooting arm. She'd been running the range at Leatherneck for 3 years, and in that time had seen every variety of ego, insecurity, and military politics that could be expressed through firearms. "Well," she'd said, holding up the target like evidence in a court-martial, "I guess that settles the question about the rifle's accuracy." The words had hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Morrison's pale eyes had swept the firing line, taking in the faces of Marines who'd witnessed something that would be impossible to explain in official report. How do you write up a subordinate who'd used martial arts to defend her right to complete a qualification? How do you discipline excellence that embarrassed authority? Maria had begun field stripping her rifle with the methodical precision that had become second nature. Each component was inspected, cleaned, and set aside with the kind of attention that suggested the weapon was both tool and talisman. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual while her mind processed what had just occurred. She'd crossed a line. That much was certain. In the military's rigid hierarchy, what she'd done could be interpreted as assault on a superior officer. It could end her career, cost her pension, land her in the brig. But as she looked around at the faces of her fellow Marines, faces that showed not condemnation but something approaching respect, she felt a strange sense of peace. Sometimes, her father's voice whispered in her memory, the only way to earn respect is to take it. The morning sun climbed higher over Camp Leatherneck, casting harsh shadows across the firing range. In a few hours, the story would begin its journey through the military communication network that operated faster than any official channel. It would be told in mess halls from Kandahar to Camp Pendleton, embellished and refined with each retelling until it achieved the status of military legend. But for now, in this moment suspended between action and consequence, Maria Elena Vasquez continued cleaning her rifle while 47 Marines watched and remembered what it looked like when someone refused to step aside. The barracks at Camp Leatherneck smelled like industrial disinfectant, stale coffee, and the particular brand of exhaustion that came from living in close quarters with people who could kill you in 17 different ways but would share their last MRE without being asked. Maria's rack military parlance for the narrow bunk that served as bedroom, office, and sanctuary occupied the corner position she'd claimed through a combination of seniority and strategic negotiation with Marines who understood that some battles weren't worth fighting. She sat cross-legged on her thin mattress, her back against the plywood wall covered in photos that told the story of a life lived in service to something larger than herself. There was her graduation from Paris Island, standing at attention in dress blues while her parents beamed with pride tinged by worry. A squad photo from her first deployment to Iraq, 12 Marines grinning at the camera with the invincible confidence of youth. Another from Afghanistan, fewer Marines and older eyes, the kind of weariness that came from watching friends come home in boxes. But the photo that drew her attention tonight was different from the others, a small, worn snapshot tucked into the corner of her mirror. It showed a 7-year-old Maria standing beside her grandfather in the backyard of their East LA home, both of them holding .22 rifles and wearing expressions of absolute concentration. Abuelo Miguel wore his Korean War veteran cap, faded and frayed but positioned with military precision. His weathered hands, scarred from 40 years of construction work, guided her small fingers to the proper grip. "Mia," he'd said in that gravelly voice that carried the weight of battles fought and lessons learned, "shooting is not about the gun. It's about respect for the weapon, for yourself, for what you can do when you decide not to be pushed around." Maria touched the photo gently, remembering how the .22 had felt enormous in her child's hands, how the first shot had surprised her with its sharpness, and the way it made her grandfather smile. "You got the steadiness," he'd told her after she'd managed to hit a tin can at 20 yards. "Now you just need to learn when to use it." 23 years later, sitting in a military barracks 7,000 miles from home, she wondered if today had been one of those times. The confrontation with Commander Morrison replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. Every detail remained crystal clear. The way his shadow had fallen across her firing position, the coffee smell on his breath, the exact pressure required to make his grip falter without causing permanent damage. She'd acted on instinct, muscle, memory trained by years of martial arts practice and refined by combat experience. But instinct didn't erase consequences, and consequences had a way of finding you in the military. Even when you were technically right. Her phone buzzed against a wall. A text from her younger brother Carlos, who was finishing his senior year at UCLA while working toward a degree in mechanical engineering. Heard from Mama today. She says you haven't called in 3 weeks. You okay out there? Maria stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How do you explain to a college student worried about midterms that you just twisted a superior officer's arm and might be facing court-martial? How do you tell your family that the daughter they'd raised to be respectful and obedient had just committed what could technically be considered assault? She typed and deleted several responses before settling on. Everything's fine. Just busy with training. Tell Mama I'll call this weekend. The lie felt heavier than her combat gear. 2 bunks down. Lance Corporal Jennifer Ghost. Patterson was reorganizing her footlocker for the 3rd time this week, a nervous habit that manifested whenever the 20-year-old Mortar woman felt the weight of military life pressing down on her shoulders. Ghost had earned her nickname not for any supernatural abilities, but for her talent at making herself invisible whenever senior NCOs were looking for volunteers for unpleasant duties. Staff Sergeant? Ghost's voice carried the particular mix of respect and curiosity that young Marines used when approaching potentially dangerous topics. Can I ask you something? Maria looked up from her phone, taking in Ghost's nervous energy and the way the younger Marine's hands kept moving, organizing and reorganizing the same items. What's on your mind, Patterson? That thing today, on the range. Ghost paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. How did you know you could do that? I mean, twist him up like that? The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond martial arts technique. Maria understood what Ghost was really asking. How did you know you wouldn't get destroyed for standing up to authority? How did you find the courage to risk everything for a principle? I didn't know, Maria admitted, sitting forward on her rack. That's the thing about standing up. You never know how it's going to turn out until after you've done it. Ghost nodded. Slowly, her hands stilling for the first time all evening. My dad always said I should keep my head down, don't make waves. He did 20 years in the Army, retired as an E7, never had a single disciplinary action. She looked up at Maria with eyes that seemed too old for her face. But he also never made it past Sergeant First Class, even though he was smart enough to be running the whole damn supply chain. And what do you think about that? Maria asked. I think maybe keeping your head down isn't always the best strategy. Maria smiled, recognizing something of herself in the younger Marines developing wisdom. Your dad was probably right for his time, his situation. But times change. The military is changing too, even when it doesn't want to admit it. From across the barracks came the sound of Corporal Michael Books, Chun reading aloud from a letter from his girlfriend back in San Francisco. Books had been an English literature major at Berkeley before dropping out to enlist, and he approached correspondence with the same analytical intensity he'd once applied to Shakespearean sonnets. Tonight he was parsing the meaning of emojis, with the dedication of a medieval scholar translating Latin. She used the hard eyes emoji, but followed it with the thinking face. Books was explaining to his bunkmate. The linguistic implications are significant. Are we talking genuine affection or ironic commentary on modern romantic expression? Chen, called out Staff Sergeant Tommy Diesel Rodriguez from his bunk near the window. It's an emoji, not the fucking Dead Sea Scrolls. Books looked genuinely offended. Language carries meaning, Staff Sergeant. The digital age hasn't eliminated nuance. It's just compressed it into tiny pictographs that require careful interpretation. Maria listened to the familiar banter, finding comfort in the routine interactions that defined barracks life. These Marines, Ghost with her nervous reorganizing, Books with his literary analysis of text messages, Diesel, with his practical dismissal of anything too complicated, had become her extended family over the course of the deployment. They'd shared firefights and boredom, MREs and care packages, the particular brand of dark humor that developed when people faced mortality together on a regular basis. But tonight, she felt a distance from their easy camaraderie. The confrontation with Morrison had changed something fundamental about her position within the unit's social structure. She was no longer just Staff Sergeant Vasquez, reliable and competent. She was now Staff Sergeant Vasquez, the Marine who'd twisted a commander's arm and shot a perfect group while the entire base watched. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from her mother. "Your Tia Rosa called. She saw something on Facebook about Marines and shooting. Made me worry. You're being careful, right? Not taking unnecessary risks?" Maria stared at the message, wondering how her aunt had managed to connect random Facebook content to her specific situation 7,000 miles away. The military family's communication network operated on principles that defied conventional understanding, carrying whispers of trouble and hints of danger across continents with supernatural efficiency. She started to type another reassuring lie, then deleted it. Instead, she wrote, "I'm doing what needs to be done, Mama, same as always." It was the most honest thing she'd said all day. Across the barracks, Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Murphy appeared in the doorway, her presence immediately shifting the room's energy from casual relaxation to attentive readiness. Iron Murphy commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation, a rare quality in senior NCOs who'd learned that fear was often more reliable than admiration. Vasquez, Murphy's voice carried the particular tone that suggested official business rather than casual conversation. "Need to see you outside." Maria felt her stomach tighten as she slipped on her boots and followed Murphy out into the Afghan night. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset, and the air carried the scent of dust, diesel fuel, and the particular emptiness that came from being very far from home. They walked in silence past the motor pool, where mechanics worked under harsh fluorescent lights to keep the endless fleet of armored vehicles operational. Past the communications building, where radio operators maintained the electronic lifelines that connected Camp Leatherneck to the wider world. Past the chapel, where Marines of various faiths gathered to wrestle with questions that had no easy answers. Murphy finally stopped near the perimeter fence, where the base's lights gave way to the vast darkness of the Afghan countryside. In the distance, guard towers stood like sentries against the night, their searchlights sweeping across terrain that had seen armies come and go for thousands of years. "Hell of a thing today," Murphy said, lighting a cigarette with hands that bore the scars of 23 years in the Marine Corps. "Morrison's been asking questions all afternoon. Wants to know about your background, your training, your disciplinary record." "And what did you tell him, Gunny?" Murphy exhaled smoke into the night air. "Told him the truth. That you're one of the best Marines I've worked with. 3 combat deployments, 2 Navy and Marine Corps achievement medals, 1 combat action ribbon. Expert marksman every qualification period for 7 years straight." She paused, studying Maria's face in the dim light. "Also told him that you've never been the type to back down from a fight, especially when you're in the right." Maria felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Murphy's support meant everything, but it wouldn't necessarily protect her if Morrison decided to pursue formal charges. "Is he going to pursue it?" she asked. "Depends," Murphy replied, flicking ash into the darkness. "Morrison's got an ego the size of Texas, but he's not stupid. What you did today, the thing with his wrist, that was textbook defensive action. You didn't strike him, didn't threaten him, just redirected his aggression in a way that made your point without crossing any lines that would stick in a court-martial. And the shooting?" Murphy smiled, the expression visible even in the low light. "The shooting was fucking beautiful, Staff Sergeant. 14 rounds, 14 hits, grouping tight enough to cover with a quarter. Morrison can't charge you with being too good at your job. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes. Two Marines sharing the particular understanding that came from years of service in an institution that demanded everything, while promising nothing beyond the opportunity to serve. "Vasquez," Murphy said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Today, when Morrison grabbed your rifle, was that planned? Did you go in there looking for a confrontation?" Maria considered the question carefully. The honest answer was complicated, layered with months of frustration over Morrison's treatment of female Marines, years of fighting for respect in a male-dominated environment, and a lifetime of her grandfather's lessons about when to stand and when to yield. "No, Gunny," she said finally. "I went in there to qualify, same as always, but when he tried to take my rifle ... She paused, searching for words that would convey the complexity of the moment. "I couldn't let him do it. Not because of the qualification, but because of what it represented." Murphy nodded slowly. "And what did it represent?" "The right to be judged on merit rather than assumptions. The right to complete what I started. The right to be respected for what I can do rather than dismissed for what I am." "And what are you, Staff Sergeant?" Maria looked out at the darkness beyond the fence, thinking of her grandfather's hands guiding her grip, her father's voice urging her to take respect rather than wait for it to be given, her mother's prayers following her across oceans and war zones. "I'm a United States Marine, Gunny, same as everyone else in this unit." Murphy finished her cigarette and field-stripped it with military efficiency, scattering the tobacco and pocketing the filter. "That's the right answer, Vasquez. Now the question is whether Morrison understands it the same way." As they walked back toward the barracks, Maria felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down like the darkness above. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve, new opportunities to prove that her actions had been justified. But tonight, surrounded by the sounds of Marines settling into uneasy sleep in a hostile land, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that she'd done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. In her rack. That night, she finally called her mother. The conversation was brief, just a daughter checking in with the woman who'd raised her to be strong, independent, and uncompromising in her principles. As she hung up, Maria caught Ghost watching her with curious eyes. "Everything okay, Staff Sergeant?" the younger Marine asked quietly. "Everything's fine, Patterson," Maria replied. And for the first time all day, she meant it completely. The mess hall at Camp Leatherneck buzzed with the particular energy that preceded any significant military drama. Word of the firing range incident had spread through the base's informal communication network with the efficiency of a biological weapon, mutating and evolving with each retelling until the basic facts were surrounded by layers of speculation, embellishment, and myth-making that would have impressed ancient bards. Maria sat at a corner table with her usual breakfast companions. Ghost, Books, Diesel, and Corporal Marcus Prophet Williams, a radio operator from Detroit who'd earned his nickname by correctly predicting 3 separate Taliban attacks through what he claimed was careful analysis of atmospheric pressure and goat migration patterns. In reality, Prophet was simply better at reading intelligence reports than most Marines and had a gift for connecting disparate pieces of information into actionable insights. This morning, Prophet was reading the room with the same analytical intensity he applied to enemy communications. "Commander Morrison's been making calls since 0500, he reported, keeping his voice low enough to avoid attracting attention from nearby tables. Had a 20-minute conversation with someone at division headquarters, another 15 minutes with the base legal officer." Books looked up from his scrambled eggs, which he'd been arranging into neat geometric patterns, while contemplating the existential implications of powdered food. "The narrative is being constructed as we speak," he said with the gravity of someone discussing Shakespearean tragedy. The question is whether it's a story of justified resistance or insubordination. Depends who's writing it, Diesel observed, cutting straight to the practical implications with his usual bluntness. Morrison's got rank and connections. Staff Sergeant's got 14 bullets in a target smaller than a playing card. Ghost, who'd been nervously rearranging her breakfast tray, looked up at Maria with an expression that mixed admiration and concern. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. Maria considered the question while watching Marines at other tables steal glances in her direction. Some faces showed respect, others curiosity. A few displayed the kind of uncomfortable awareness that came when someone disrupted the established order of things. "Scared of what?" she replied. "Court-martial? Loss of rank? Getting kicked out?" "All of it?" "No," Maria said, surprised by her own certainty. "I'm not scared of the consequences. I'm scared of what would have happened if I'd done nothing." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of First Sergeant Donald "Top" Martinez, a barrel-chested Marine from New Mexico who'd served as the senior enlisted advisor for Bravo Company through 2 previous deployments. Top Martinez commanded. Respect through a combination of combat experience, institutional knowledge, and the kind of paternal authority that made Marines want to make him proud rather than disappoint him. Staff Sergeant Vasquez. Top's voice carried the formal tone that preceded significant announcements. "Commander Morrison wants to see you in his office at 1000 hours. The mess hall didn't exactly fall silent, but conversations definitely shifted to lower volumes as Marines processed this development. Being summoned to the commander's office could mean anything from a commendation to a court-martial, but given yesterday's events, the possibilities skewed heavily toward the unpleasant end of the spectrum. "Understood, First Sergeant," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the churning sensation in her stomach. Top Martinez studied her face for a moment, his weathered features revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Might want to review Marine Corps Order 1020.34H beforehand," he said quietly, referring to the regulation that governed equal opportunity and treatment within the Corps. Section 4, subsections C through G. With that cryptic guidance he moved onto other tables and other business, leaving Maria to contemplate the implications of his suggestion. Top Martinez didn't waste words or offer advice lightly if he was pointing her towards specific regulations. There was a reason books, whose literary education had made him something of an expert at reading subtext, leaned across the table. "He's giving you ammunition," he whispered. "Whatever Morrison has planned, Top thinks you're going to need regulatory backing." The morning passed slowly. Each routine task waited with anticipation. Maria conducted weapon maintenance with her squad, supervised a communications exercise, and reviewed the day's patrol reports. All normal duties performed with the hyper-aware focus that came from knowing she was being watched more closely than usual. At 0945, she knocked on the door of Commander Morrison's office, a cramped space that served as both administrative center and throne room for Bravo Company's commanding officer. The walls displayed the usual collection of military memorabilia, unit citations, deployment photos, a map of Afghanistan covered in colored pins, marking various strategic points and problem areas. Morrison sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to render verdict, his uniform pressed to parade ground perfection, his pale eyes fixed on Maria with the intensity of someone who'd spent the morning preparing for war. To his left sat Captain Jennifer Walsh, the company's legal officer, a Harvard Law graduate, who'd joined the Marines to pay off student loans and discovered she actually enjoyed military service. Walsh's presence suggested this meeting would involve more than simple disciplinary action. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, reporting as ordered," Maria announced, standing at attention with the ramrod-straight posture that had been drilled into her at Paris Island. "At ease," Morrison replied, though his tone suggested anything but relaxation. "Take a seat." Maria settled into the chair across from Morrison's desk. maintaining the alert readiness that marked professional Marines in formal situations. Captain. Walsh smiled encouragingly, but her hands were positioned over a legal pad covered in notes, never a good sign when lawyers were involved. Staff Sergeant, Morrison began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed his opening statement. Yesterday's incident on the firing range has raised several concerns that need to be addressed. Yes, sir. Let's start. With your actions when I requested use of your weapon for verification purposes. Can you walk me through your decision-making process? Maria had anticipated this question, had rehearsed her response during the sleepless hours before dawn. Sir, I was in the middle of a qualification exercise, with 6 rounds remaining in tow. My relay, according to Marine Corps Order 3574.2K, a Marine cannot be interrupted during qualification fire unless there is an imminent safety concern. She paused, meeting Morrison's gaze steadily. When you requested the weapon, I asked if there was a safety concern. When none was identified, I continued my qualification as required by regulation. Captain Walsh made a note on her legal pad, her expression neutral but attentive. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that Maria recognized from poker games and interrogation training. And the physical contact that followed? Morrison continued. When you twisted my wrist? Sir, when you attempted to take possession of my weapon while I was in a firing position, I perceived a potential safety hazard. My response was to secure the weapon and remove the perceived threat through minimal necessary force. Maria's voice remained steady, professional. The technique I used is taught in the Marine Corps' martial arts program as appropriate for weapon retention scenarios. Morrison's face flushed slightly, the color creeping up his neck like rising mercury. Staff Sergeant, are you suggesting that I posed a safety threat? The question hung in the air like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Maria understood that her answer would determine whether this remained a disciplinary discussion or escalated into something that could end her career. She thought of Top Martinez's advice, of the regulation he'd referenced, of the principle that had driven her actions in the first place. Sir, I'm suggesting that attempting to remove a weapon from a Marine during qualification fire creates an inherently dangerous situation, regardless of intent, Maria replied carefully. My training dictated that I secure the weapon and de-escalate the situation using minimal force. Captain Walsh looked up from her notes, her expression thoughtful. Staff Sergeant, in your assessment, was Commander Morrison's request lawful? The question cut to the heart of the matter with surgical precision. Maria felt the weight of her career balancing on the edge of her response. Ma'am, the request itself may have been within the commander's authority, but the timing and method created a conflict with established safety protocols and qualification procedures. Morrison's hands clenched into fists on his desktop. Staff Sergeant, are you questioning my judgment? No, sir. I'm explaining my actions in context of the training and regulations that govern my responsibilities as a Marine. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a bayonet. Captain Walsh continued making notes, her pen scratching across the legal pad with the steady rhythm of someone documenting potentially explosive testimony. Morrison stared at Maria with the frustrated intensity of a man who'd expected contrition and found principled resistance instead. Let's move on to your shooting performance, Morrison continued, shifting tactics like a prosecutor, changing angles of attack. The range safety officer reported an unusually tight grouping. Some might question whether such precision is natural. Maria felt a cold anger building in her chest. The same fire that had driven her through 3 combat deployments and countless challenges to her competence. Sir, are you suggesting that my marksmanship was somehow artificial? I'm suggesting that exceptional performance under stress sometimes raises questions about methods. Captain Walsh looked up sharply, her legal training obviously raising red flags about the implications of Morrison's statement. Commander, Are you alleging that Staff Sergeant Vasquez used unauthorized equipment or assistance during her qualification? Morrison's face reddened further. I'm noting that her performance was unusually precise given the circumstances. Sir, Maria said, her voice carrying an edge that could cut glass, my marksmanship record is documented across 7 years of service. I've qualified expert every period since my initial training. I've completed advanced marksmanship courses at both Camp Pendleton and Quantico. During my second deployment to Afghanistan, I was attached to a scout sniper platoon as a designated marksman. She paused, letting the weight of her credentials settle in the air. My shooting yesterday was consistent with my established skill level and training. The silence that followed was broken by Captain Walsh clearing her throat diplomatically. Commander, perhaps we should focus on the specific incidents rather than questioning established qualifications. Morrison's jaw worked like he was chewing something particularly bitter. Very well. Staff Sergeant, do you believe your actions yesterday were appropriate for a Marine of your rank and experience? Yes, sir. I believe they were necessary and justified, even though they resulted in a confrontation with your commanding officer? Sir, respectfully, the confrontation began when my qualification was interrupted without safety justification. My actions were responsive, not initiating. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, Morrison probing for weaknesses in Maria's position while Captain Walsh documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that careers could hang on the precise wording of official reports. They discussed regulations, precedents, the chain of command, and the particular challenges of maintaining discipline in a combat environment. Finally, Morrison leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who'd expected an easy victory and found himself fighting a draw. Staff Sergeant, you're dismissed. But understand this, I'll be watching your performance very closely going forward. Understood, sir. As Maria rose to leave, Captain Walsh spoke quietly. Staff Sergeant, a word of advice: document everything. Keep copies of all reports, correspondence, and performance evaluations. Just as a precaution. Maria nodded her understanding and left the office with the distinct impression that the morning's confrontation had been merely the opening skirmish in a longer campaign. The next several days brought a series of escalating incidents that felt like a coordinated campaign of harassment disguised as normal military operations. It started with small things: Maria's squad being assigned to extra duty details, their equipment inspections being conducted with unusual scrutiny, their patrol routes being adjusted to include the most dangerous areas of their operational zone. On Wednesday, Maria arrived at her morning briefing to find that her squad had been tasked with a particularly hazardous mission, escorting a supply convoy through a section of road that had seen 3 IED attacks in the previous month. The mission itself was an unusual convoy escort, was a routine part of their duties, but the timing and composition of the patrol seemed designed to put her squad at maximum risk with minimal support. Interesting route selection, Prophet observed. As he studied the mission briefing, the radio operator had developed an almost supernatural ability to read between the lines of official communications. No air support, minimal quick reaction force standby, and we're taking the road that Taliban spotters have been watching for 2 weeks. Books looked up from the tactical map with the expression of someone analyzing a particularly dark piece of literature. The narrative structure is becoming clear, he said grimly. This isn't about completing the mission, it's about creating conditions for failure. Diesel, who approached military politics with the same directness he applied to everything else, cut straight to the point. Morrison's trying to get you killed, Staff Sergeant. Or at least hoping you'll fuck up badly enough to justify whatever he's planning next. Ghost, whose nervous energy had been building all week, finally voiced the question everyone was thinking. What are we going to do about it? Maria looked around at her squad, 4 Marines who'd followed her through combat zones and difficult missions, who trusted her judgment and relied on her leadership. They deserved better than being used as pawns in Morrison's personal vendetta, but they also deserved a leader who wouldn't compromise their safety for the sake of pride. "We're going to do our jobs," she said firmly. "We're going to execute this mission with the same professionalism we bring to every operation. And we're going to prove that no amount of political pressure can make us anything less than Marines." The convoy mission turned out to be a masterclass in military professionalism under pressure. Maria's squad executed their assigned duties flawlessly, maintaining security protocols while adapting to changing conditions with the fluid precision that came from extensive combat experience. When Taliban spotters were detected along the route, Ghost's mortar team provided suppressive fire that allowed the convoy to pass through the danger zone without casualties. Prophet's communications management kept all elements of the operation informed and coordinated, while Books applied his analytical skills to route planning that avoided 3 potential ambush sites. Diesel's mechanical expertise kept their vehicles operational, despite the challenging terrain and extreme heat that turned metal surfaces into torture devices. Most importantly, they completed the mission without giving Morrison any ammunition for criticism. Every procedure was followed exactly, every report was filed promptly and accurately, every piece of equipment was accounted for and properly maintained. But success, Maria was learning, could be just as dangerous as failure when you were dealing with someone determined to find fault. Thursday brought a new escalation, an unannounced inspection of Maria's squad's equipment and living quarters. Morrison arrived at 060 with a clipboard and the kind of hostile attention to detail usually reserved for enemies rather than Marines under his command. He examined everything from the cleanliness of weapon components to the arrangement of personal items in footlockers. The inspection was clearly designed to find violations where none existed. Morrison spent 20 minutes examining Ghost's rifle, searching for non-existent deficiencies. He questioned Books about the organization of his reference materials, suggesting that maintaining personal books might be inconsistent with military priorities. He criticized Diesel's tool maintenance procedures despite the obvious excellence of his work, but it was when Morrison reached Maria's area that the inspection revealed its true purpose. He picked up a small framed photograph from her footlocker, the picture of her and her grandfather at the shooting range, and studied it with exaggerated interest. "Interesting family history, Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying implications that made Maria's skin crawl. "Your grandfather served in Korea?" "Yes, sir. Army Infantry, 1951 to 1953. "And he taught you to shoot?" "He taught me many things, sir. Shooting was just one of them." Morrison continued examining the photograph as if it contained classified information. "Must have been quite an influence on your development. Some might say that civilian training creates conflicts with military doctrine." The implication was clear. Morrison was suggesting that Maria's marksmanship skills came from sources outside proper military channels, that her grandfather's influence somehow made her less reliable as a Marine. It was a subtle attack on her family, her background, and her legitimacy as a warrior. Maria felt the familiar fire building in her chest, but she also heard Captain Walsh's advice echoing in her memory. "Document everything." "Sir, my grandfather's military service and his guidance helped inspire my decision to serve. I consider his influence to be completely consistent with Marine Corps' values." Morrison set the photograph down with deliberate care, but not before. Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. He'd been holding it upside down, studying not the image but something written on the back. When she retrieved the photo after the inspection, she found what he'd been reading, a note her grandfather had written years ago in his careful handwriting. "Para mí nita valenta courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." The fact that Morrison could read Spanish wasn't the problem. The problem was that he'd been looking for personal information to use against her. digging into her family history and private memories in search of weapons for his campaign of harassment. That afternoon, Maria found herself summoned to another meeting, this time with the base chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, a Navy officer who served the spiritual needs of Marines from multiple faith traditions. Chaplain Chun was a small woman with kind eyes and the particular quality of patient attention that made people want to tell her their troubles. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Chaplain Chun said warmly, "please have a seat. Can I get you some coffee? Water?" Maria settled into a comfortable chair in the chaplain's office, a space that felt dramatically different from Morrison's stark command center. Books lined the walls, not just religious texts but philosophy, psychology, literature from various cultures. A small fountain in the corner provided the gentle sound of flowing water, and photographs of service members from various deployments created a mosaic of faces and stories. "I'm fine, ma'am, thank you." Chaplain Chun poured herself tea from a thermos and settled into the chair across from Maria with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that important conversations couldn't be rushed. "I wanted to speak with you about some concerns that have been brought to my attention." Maria felt her defenses rising automatically. "Ma'am, there are reports that you might be experiencing unusual stress, that recent events may be affecting your emotional stability and decision-making processes." Chaplain Chun's voice carried no judgment, but Maria recognized the clinical language of psychological evaluation. "Ma'am, who reported these concerns? I'm not at liberty to discuss specific sources, but I want you to know that seeking help, whether spiritual, psychological, or emotional, is never a sign of weakness. It's a sign of wisdom." Maria understood immediately what was happening. Morrison couldn't attack her marksmanship or her tactical competence, couldn't find fault with her squad's performance or her adherence to regulations. So he was shifting to a different angle of attack, her mental health and emotional stability. "Chaplain, I appreciate your concern, but I want to be very clear. I am not experiencing unusual stress beyond what's normal for our deployment environment. My decision-making has been consistent with my training and the regulations that govern my duties. If someone has suggested otherwise, they're either misinformed or deliberately mischaracterizing the situation." Chaplain Chen studied Maria's face with the careful attention of someone trained to recognize signs of distress, deception, or genuine resilience. "Can you tell me about the incident on the firing range? From your perspective?" Maria recounted the events of that morning, from her arrival at the range through the confrontation with Morrison to the precision shooting that had followed. "Chaplain." Chun listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly just providing the kind of focused attention that allowed difficult truths to emerge. "And how did you feel after these events?" the chaplain asked when Maria finished her account. "Calm," Maria replied without hesitation, "focused. Like I was finally doing what needed to be done, instead of accepting what I was told should be acceptable." "No anger? No emotional distress?" "I was angry about being interrupted during qualification. I was frustrated with the implication that I didn't deserve to complete what I'd started. But my actions were controlled, calculated responses to specific situations, not emotional reactions." Chaplain Chun made a few more notes, then set aside her pad and looked directly at Maria. "Staff Sergeant, off the record, and I mean completely off the record, what do you think is really happening here?" The question hung in the air between them, an invitation to speak truth rather than maintain official positions. Maria considered her response carefully, understanding that even off-the-record conversations could find their way into official reports if circumstances demanded it. "Ma'am, I think there are people in positions of authority who are uncomfortable with Marines who don't fit their expectations of what Marines should be. I think my actions on the firing range challenged some assumptions about hierarchy, authority, and who deserves respect. And I think there are ongoing efforts to make me pay for that challenge." Chaplain Chun nodded slowly. And how do you plan to respond to these efforts? By continuing to do my job with the same level of professionalism I've maintained throughout my career. By documenting everything and following proper channels. By not giving anyone legitimate grounds for disciplinary action. Maria paused, thinking of her grandfather's photograph and Morrison's invasion of her personal space. And by remembering that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. The chaplain smiled for the first time during their conversation. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was, ma'am. He taught me that respect isn't something you're given. It's something you earn and something you take when earning it isn't enough. Friday brought the most serious escalation yet. A formal complaint filed by Morrison, alleging that Maria had created a hostile work environment through her aggressive behavior and insubordinate attitude. The complaint, which Prophet had somehow obtained a copy of through his mysterious intelligence networks, painted a picture of a staff sergeant who'd become increasingly unstable and difficult to manage. According to Morrison's version of events, Maria had been displaying signs of stress-related behavioral changes for weeks before the firing range incident. Her confrontational approach to leadership had created tension within her squad and undermined unit cohesion. The physical altercation during qualification fire was presented as the culmination of a pattern of aggressive behavior that posed a threat to military discipline and order. Most damningly, Morrison claimed that several Marines had approached him with concerns about Maria's leadership style and emotional stability. He suggested that her squad members were afraid to speak openly about their concerns for fear of retaliation. It's masterfully constructed, Books observed as he analyzed the complaint with his literature professor's eye for narrative structure. Each allegation is technically possible to prove or disprove, but the overall impression creates doubt about your fitness for leadership, regardless of the specific facts. Prophet, who'd been monitoring radio traffic and official communications, with his usual paranoid diligence, added another disturbing piece to the puzzle. Words coming down from division that there might be an inspector general investigation. Morrison's been building a case that goes way beyond the firing range incident. Ghost looked up from her nervous reorganizing with an expression that mixed anger and determination. Staff Sergeant, you need to know nobody in this squad has talked to Morrison about concerns. Nobody thinks you're unstable or aggressive. We've all been approached by people asking questions, but we've made it clear that we support you completely. Diesel nodded grimly. Been getting visits from people wanting to know if you've seemed different lately, if we've noticed changes in your behavior, if we feel safe under your leadership. Every question designed to create doubt, even if we answer positively. Maria felt a mixture of gratitude and anger. Gratitude for her squad's loyalty, anger at the systematic campaign being waged against her reputation and career. She understood now that Morrison wasn't just trying to discipline her for the firing range incident. He was trying to destroy her credibility completely, to make her an example of what happened to Marines who challenged authority. That evening, as she sat in her rack reviewing the formal complaint and planning her response, Maria received an unexpected visitor. First Sergeant Martinez appeared at her bunk with the expression of a man carrying bad news and good advice in equal measure. "Walk with me, Staff Sergeant," he said quietly. They ended up in the same spot near the perimeter fence where she'd talked with Gunnery Sergeant Murphy days earlier. The Afghan night was crisp and clear, stars visible in a way that was impossible in the light-polluted cities where most Marines had grown up. "You've got a choice to make," Top Martinez said without preamble. "Morrison's building a case that could end your career. Inspector General investigation, possible court-martial, definitely a transfer to some shit assignment where you'll spend the rest of your enlistment counting supplies in a warehouse." Maria nodded, having reached the same conclusion through her own analysis of the situation. "Or," Martinez continued, "you can request a transfer. I've got connections at Camp Pendleton. Could get you assigned to a training unit where your marksmanship skills would be appreciated. Clean slate, new command, Chance to rebuild your career away from this political bullshit. The offer hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Maria understood that Top Martinez was trying to help her, was offering a way out of a situation that was rapidly becoming impossible to navigate successfully. "What do you think I should do, First Sergeant?" Martinez was quiet for a long moment, studying the darkness beyond the fence. "Honestly, part of me thinks you should take the transfer. Morrison's got more resources than you do, more connections, more institutional support. Fighting him is like charging a machine gun nest with a pistol, brave, but not necessarily smart." "And the other part?" "The other part thinks that if you run now, nothing changes. Morrison keeps being Morrison, keeps using his position to intimidate Marines who don't fit his idea of what Marines should be. And every female Marine who comes after you learns that challenging authority, even when you're right, is a career-ending move." Maria looked up at the stars, thinking of her grandfather's lessons about when to stand and when to yield, her father's voice urging her to take respect rather than wait for it to be given, her mother's prayers following her across oceans and war zones. "First Sergeant, what would happen if this Inspector General investigation actually found that Morrison was wrong? That his complaints were unfounded?" Martinez smiled grimly. "Then you'd be vindicated. He'd probably get a letter of reprimand in his file, and life would go on. But that's a big if, Staff Sergeant. The system tends to protect people like Morrison and sacrifice people like you. Even when people like me are right. Especially when people like you are right. Because if they admit you were right to stand up to Morrison, they have to admit there might be other Morrisons out there. They have to question the system that made him a commander in the first place." Maria felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like the darkness above. She could take the transfer, start over, build a new career away from the toxic environment Morrison had created. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that prioritized her personal survival over broader principles. Or she could stay and fight, knowing that the odds were stacked against her, but that running would validate every assumption Morrison had made about her fitness for leadership. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Take your time," Martinez replied, "but don't take too much time. Morrison's moving fast, and once that Inspector General investigation gets started, your options become a lot more limited." As they walked back toward the barracks, Maria felt the familiar fire building in her chest. Not anger this time, but determination. She thought of Ghost's nervous energy and Book's analytical mind, of Diesel's straightforward competence and Prophet's intuitive understanding of military politics. She thought of all the Marines who were watching this situation unfold, learning lessons about what it meant to stand up for yourself in an institution that demanded both absolute obedience and individual excellence. Most of all, she thought of her grandfather's photograph, turned upside down in Morrison's hands as he searched for ammunition to use against her family, her background, her right to be treated as an equal among Marines. By the time they reached the barracks, Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez had made her decision. The Inspector General's office at Camp Leatherneck occupied a trailer that had seen better days, better wars, and definitely better coffee. Major Patricia Williams, a JAG officer from Cincinnati who'd volunteered for the deployment to escape a messy divorce and discovered she actually enjoyed military investigative work, sat across from Maria at a folding table that wobbled every time someone shifted position. Major Williams had the kind of sharp intelligence that made people nervous and the particular brand of professional skepticism that came from years of separating truth from military mythology. She'd arrived from division headquarters 3 days earlier with a briefcase full of regulations, a laptop full of forms, and the patient demeanor of someone who understood that the most important truths often emerge slowly. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Major Williams began, her voice carrying the neutral tone that marked experienced investigators. "I want to be clear about the scope and purpose of this investigation. We're here to determine whether the allegations in Commander Morrison's complaint have merit and whether proper procedures were followed in the incidents under review." Maria sat at attention, though Major Williams had indicated she could relax. After 2 weeks of escalating harassment disguised as normal military operations, formal positions felt safer than casual ones. "Yes, ma'am. I've reviewed the initial reports, spoken with several witnesses, and examined the physical evidence available. Now I'd like to hear your version of events, starting with the morning of the firing range incident." For the third time in 2 weeks, Maria recounted the story of that morning, Morrison's arrival on the firing line, his demand for her weapon, the confrontation that followed, and the precision shooting that had turned a routine qualification into legend. But this time, she included details that hadn't been relevant to previous discussions. The way Morrison had been watching her even before approaching her position, the coffee smell on his breath that suggested he'd been planning this confrontation. Over breakfast, the deliberate timing of his intervention, just as she was completing her qualification. Major Williams listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly providing the kind of focused attention that encouraged complete honesty. When Maria finished her account, the investigator leaned back in her chair and consulted her notes. "Several witnesses have corroborated your version of events regarding the firing range incident," Major Williams said. "However, Commander Morrison has raised concerns about your behavior and leadership style that allegedly preceded this confrontation. He suggests this was part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident." "Ma'am, I'd like to address those allegations directly if possible." "Please do." Maria had spent the previous week preparing for this moment, documenting every interaction with Morrison and his supporters, reviewing her performance evaluations, and conducting her own informal investigation into the campaign being waged against her. What she'd discovered was both disturbing and revealing. "Major Williams, I believe Commander Morrison's allegations are part of a deliberate effort to discredit me following the firing range incident. In the 2 weeks since that confrontation, my squad has been assigned to unusually dangerous missions. With minimal support, subjected to harassment disguised as inspections, and approached by individuals seeking negative information about my leadership." Maria paused, consulting her own notes. "I've documented 14 separate incidents that suggest coordinated retaliation rather than legitimate command concerns." Major Williams looked up from her notepad with increased interest. "Can you provide specifics?" Maria opened the folder she'd prepared, containing copies of mission assignments, inspection reports, and witness statements from her squad members. "On October 15th, my squad was assigned convoy escort duty through a road section that had experienced 3 IED attacks. In the previous month, with no air support and minimal quick reaction force backup. This assignment came 12 hours after my meeting with Commander Morrison and Captain Walsh." She continued methodically through her documentation. The unannounced equipment inspection, where Morrison had examined her personal photographs. The visits to her squad members by individuals asking leading questions about her emotional stability. The series of administrative delays that had prevented her from filing proper responses to the allegations against her. Most significantly, Maria continued, "I've learned that at least 3 of the Marines who allegedly approached Commander Morrison with concerns about my leadership have since stated they never made such complaints. Lance Corporal Patterson, Corporal Chun, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez have all provided written statements indicating they were approached by others asking questions about my behavior, but that they never initiated complaints or expressed concerns about my leadership to anyone in the chain of command." Major Williams examined the witness statements Maria provided, her expression growing increasingly serious as she read. Professional investigators developed instincts about truth and deception, and Maria could see recognition dawning in the Major's eyes. "Staff Sergeant, these are serious allegations. You're suggesting that Commander Morrison fabricated complaints and engaged in retaliatory harassment. Ma'am, I'm providing documented evidence that suggests the allegations against me may not be based on legitimate command concerns, but rather on personal or professional conflicts that arose from the firing range incident. The investigation continued for 3 more days, during which Major Williams interviewed dozens of Marines, reviewed months of performance evaluations, and examined every aspect of Maria's service record. What emerged was a picture that contradicted Morrison's allegations point by point. Gunnery Sergeant Murphy testified that Maria was one of the most competent and reliable staff sergeants she'd worked with in 23 years of service. First Sergeant Martinez provided documentation showing that Maria's squad consistently received superior ratings on performance evaluations and had never been the subject of disciplinary action or command concern. More damningly, several Marines came forward to describe their own experiences with Morrison's leadership style. Corporal Lisa "Tank" Thompson, a motor transport operator from Oregon, described how Morrison had questioned her fitness for duty after she'd reported a maintenance issue that delayed a convoy mission. Lance Corporal David "Spark" Kim, an electronics technician, recounted how Morrison had suggested he might be better suited for administrative duties rather than technical work after he disagreed with the equipment procurement decision. The pattern that emerged was one of a commander who used his authority to punish Marines who challenged his decisions or exceeded his expectations, regardless of whether their actions were justified or beneficial to the unit. But the most significant revelation came from an unexpected source. Prophet Williams, the radio operator, whose analytical skills and intelligence networks had made him invaluable to the investigation he wasn't supposed to know was happening. Major Williams, Prophet said during his formal interview, "I need to provide some information that might be relevant to this investigation." Prophet had been monitoring radio communications and official message traffic with his usual paranoid attention to detail, looking for patterns that might indicate broader problems within the command structure. What he discovered was a series of communications between Morrison and officers at division headquarters that suggested the Inspector General investigation had been discussed and planned before the formal complaint was ever filed. "Sir," Prophet continued, addressing Major Williams with the nervous energy of someone who understood he was potentially ending his own career, "I have copies of message traffic indicating that Commander Morrison was in communication with division personnel about Staff Sergeant Vasquez's attitude problem 3 days before the firing range incident occurred." Major Williams leaned forward, her investigator's instincts suddenly at full alert. "Are you saying Commander Morrison was planning action against Staff Sergeant Vasquez before the incident that supposedly triggered his complaint?" "Ma'am, the communications I intercepted suggest that the firing range confrontation may have been deliberately provoked to provide justification for disciplinary action that was already being planned." The implications were staggering. If Prophet's intelligence was accurate, Morrison hadn't reacted to Maria's actions on the firing range. He'd orchestrated the entire situation to create grounds for removing her from his command. Major Williams spent another 2 days verifying Prophet's information, using her own intelligence networks and official channels to confirm the existence and content of the communications he described. What she found supported his allegations. Morrison had indeed been discussing Maria's problematic attitude with division personnel before any incident had occurred, and had specifically mentioned his intention to find grounds for disciplinary action. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source, Captain Jennifer Walsh, the legal officer who'd been present during Maria's disciplinary meeting with Morrison. Captain Walsh requested a private meeting with Major Williams, citing concerns about legal and ethical issues related to the case. "Major Williams," Captain Walsh said in the privacy of the Inspector General's trailer, "I need to provide information that may affect this investigation, but I want to ensure I'm protected under whistleblower provisions." Major Williams assured her that proper protections would be in place. And Captain Walsh proceeded to describe her growing concerns about Morrison's conduct during and after the firing range incident. Commander Morrison asked me to research legal precedents for disciplinary action against Marines who used force against superior officers, but he specifically requested that I focus on cases involving female Marines. When I questioned the relevance of gender to the legal analysis, he suggested that female Marines might be inherently more prone to emotional outbursts and poor judgment under stress. Captain Walsh continued, describing how Morrison had pressured her to find regulatory justification for his planned disciplinary actions, and how he'd become increasingly frustrated when she'd explained that Maria's actions appeared to be legally justified under existing regulations. Most concerning, Captain Walsh said, Commander Morrison has made several comments suggesting that he believes female Marines are fundamentally unsuited for combat roles and leadership positions. He specifically stated that Staff Sergeant Vasquez's actions prove that women become hysterical and dangerous when placed under pressure. The picture that emerged from 5 days of intensive investigation was clear and disturbing. Commander Morrison had targeted Maria for removal not because of any legitimate performance or behavioral concerns, but because her competence and confidence challenged his preconceptions about women in the military. The firing range incident hadn't been the catalyst for disciplinary action, it had been the excuse Morrison was looking for to justify actions he'd already decided to take. On the 6th day of the investigation, Major Williams called Maria back to the trailer for what she termed a preliminary findings discussion. Maria arrived expecting another round of questions and prepared for the possibility that the investigation might conclude that Morrison's allegations had merit, despite the evidence to the contrary. Instead, Major Williams began the meeting with an apology. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Major Williams said, I want to apologize on behalf of the Marine Corps for what you've endured over the past month. The investigation has revealed serious misconduct on the part of your commanding officer and a pattern of behavior that violates both regulations and the fundamental principles of military leadership. Maria felt a mixture of relief and vindication wash over her, followed immediately by a surge of anger at the weeks of harassment she'd endured, while the truth slowly emerged. Ma'am, what happens now? Now we ensure that proper action is taken to address the misconduct that's been identified, that you receive the support and recognition you deserve, and that measures are put in place to prevent similar incidents in the future. Major Williams explained that her preliminary findings would result in immediate changes to the command structure at Camp Leatherneck. Morrison would be relieved of command pending a formal investigation by division headquarters. His complaints against Maria would be withdrawn and expunged from her service record. Most importantly, she would receive formal recognition for her professionalism and competence throughout the ordeal. There's something else, Major Williams continued. Your actions on the firing range that morning, both the way you handled the confrontation and your subsequent shooting performance, have been brought to the attention of some people who are very interested in Marines, with your particular combination of skills and character. Maria looked puzzled, unsure what the investigator meant. Staff Sergeant, have you ever considered instructor duty? Specifically, marksmanship instruction at a formal school? The question opened possibilities that Maria hadn't considered. Throughout her career, she'd focused on being the best Marine she could be within her assigned roles, but she'd never thought about sharing her skills with the next generation of Marines. I've never really thought about it, ma'am. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Well, I'd suggest you start thinking about it. The Marksmanship Training Unit at Quantico is looking for NCOs with your qualifications and experience. Given your performance during this investigation and your documented expertise, you'd be an ideal candidate. As Maria left the Inspector General's trailer that afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The truth had finally emerged. Justice was being served. And her career was not only intact, but potentially moving in directions she'd never imagined. But the most satisfying moment came that evening, when word spread through the base that Commander Morrison had been relieved of command and was being transferred pending further investigation. The Marines of Bravo Company gathered in the mess hall, not for any official celebration, but for the kind of informal recognition that occurred when people who'd witnessed injustice finally saw it. A dressed ghost approached Maria with tears in her eyes and a smile that could have powered the entire base. "Staff Sergeant, we never doubted you for a minute. We knew you were right. We knew you were being treated unfairly, and we knew that eventually the truth would come out." Books, in his typically literary way, summarized the situation with characteristic precision. The narrative arc has reached its proper resolution. Justice delayed but not denied. Truth emerging despite systematic efforts to suppress it. And the good guys winning in the end. Diesel, as always, cut straight to the practical implications. "So what happens now, Staff Sergeant? You staying with U.S., or are you moving on to bigger and better things?" Prophet, whose intelligence gathering had been instrumental in revealing the truth, offered his own perspective. "Whatever happens next, everyone on this base now knows that standing up for yourself isn't career suicide. Sometimes it's the only way to survive with your integrity intact." As Maria looked around at the faces of Marines who'd supported her through the most difficult period of her career, she felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with determination. She'd fought for the principle that competence and character mattered more than politics and prejudice, and she'd won. The pattern that emerged was one of a commander who used his authority to punish Marines who challenged his decisions or exceeded his expectations, regardless of whether their actions were justified or beneficial to the unit. But the most significant revelation came from an unexpected source, Prophet Williams, the radio operator whose analytical skills and intelligence networks had made him invaluable to the investigation he wasn't supposed to know was happening. Major Williams, Prophet, said during his formal interview, "I need to provide some information that might be relevant to this investigation." Prophet had been monitoring radio communications and official message traffic with his usual paranoid attention to detail, looking for patterns that might indicate broader problems within the command structure. What he'd discovered was a series of communications between Morrison and officers at division headquarters that suggested the Inspector General investigation had been discussed and planned before the formal complaint was ever filed. "Sir," Prophet continued, addressing Major Williams with the nervous energy of someone who understood he was potentially ending his own career, "I have copies of message traffic indicating that Commander Morrison was in communication with division personnel about Staff Sergeant Vasquez's attitude problem 3 days before the firing range incident occurred." Major Williams leaned forward, her investigator's instincts suddenly at full alert. "Are you saying Commander Morrison was planning action against Staff Sergeant Vasquez before the incident that supposedly triggered his complaint?" "Ma'am, the communications I intercepted suggest that the firing range confrontation may have been deliberately provoked to provide justification for disciplinary action that was already being planned." The implications were staggering. If Prophet's intelligence was accurate, Morrison hadn't reacted to Maria's actions on the firing range. He'd orchestrated the entire situation to create grounds for removing her from his command. Major Williams spent another 2 days verifying Prophet's information, using her own intelligence networks and official channels to confirm the existence and content of the communications he described. What she found supported his allegations. Morrison had indeed been discussing Maria's problematic attitude with division personnel before any incident had occurred, and had specifically mentioned his intention to find grounds for disciplinary action. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source, Captain Jennifer Walsh, the legal officer who'd been present during Maria's disciplinary meeting with Morrison. Captain Walsh requested a private meeting with Major Williams, citing concerns about legal and ethical issues related to the case. Major Williams, Captain Walsh said in the privacy of the Inspector General's trailer, I need to provide information that may affect this investigation, but I want to ensure I'm protected under whistleblower provisions. Major Williams assured her that proper protections would be in place, and Captain Walsh proceeded to describe her growing concerns about Morrison's conduct during and after the firing range incident. Commander Morrison asked me to research legal precedents for disciplinary action against Marines who used force against superior officers, but he specifically requested that I focus on cases involving female Marines. When I questioned the relevance of gender to the legal analysis, he suggested that female Marines might be inherently more prone to emotional outbursts and poor judgment under stress. Captain Walsh continued, describing how Morrison had pressured her to find regulatory justification for his planned disciplinary actions, and how he'd become increasingly frustrated when she'd explained that Maria's actions appeared to be legally justified under existing regulations. Most concerning, Captain Walsh said, Commander Morrison has made several comments suggesting that he believes female Marines are fundamentally unsuited for combat roles and leadership positions. He specifically stated that Staff Sergeant Vasquez's actions prove that women become hysterical and dangerous when placed under pressure. The picture that emerged from 5 days of intensive investigation was clear and disturbing. Commander Morrison had targeted Maria for removal not because of any legitimate performance or behavioral concerns, but because her competence and confidence challenged his preconceptions about women in the military. The firing range incident hadn't been the catalyst for disciplinary action, it had been the excuse Morrison was looking for to justify actions he'd already decided to take. On the 6th day of the investigation, Major Williams called Maria back to the trailer for what she termed a preliminary findings discussion. Maria arrived expecting another round of questions and prepared for the possibility that the investigation might conclude that Morrison's allegations had merit, despite the evidence to the contrary. Instead, Major Williams began the meeting with an apology. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Major Williams said, I want to apologize on behalf of the Marine Corps for what you've endured over the past month. The investigation has revealed serious misconduct on the part of your commanding officer, and a pattern of behavior that violates both regulations and the fundamental principles of military leadership. Maria felt a mixture of relief and vindication wash over her, followed immediately by a surge of anger at the weeks of harassment she'd endured, while the truth slowly emerged. Ma'am, what happens now? Now we ensure that proper action is taken to address the misconduct that's been identified, that you receive the support and recognition you deserve, and that measures are put in place to prevent similar incidents in the future. Major Williams explained that her preliminary findings would result in immediate changes to the command structure at Camp Leatherneck. Morrison would be relieved of command pending a formal investigation by division headquarters. His complaints against Maria would be withdrawn and expunged from her service record. Most importantly, she would receive formal recognition for her professionalism and competence throughout the ordeal. There's something else, Major Williams continued. Your actions on the firing range that morning, both the way you handled the confrontation and your subsequent shooting performance, have been brought to the attention of some people who are very interested in Marines with your particular combination of skills and character. Maria looked puzzled, unsure what the investigator meant. Staff Sergeant, have you ever considered instructor duty? Specifically, marksmanship instruction at a formal school? The question opened possibilities that Maria hadn't considered. Throughout her career, she'd focused on being the best Marine she could be within her assigned roles, but she'd never thought about sharing her skills with the next generation of Marines. I've never really thought about it, ma'am. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Well, I'd suggest you start thinking about it. The Marksmanship Training Unit at Quantico is looking for NCOs with your qualifications and experience. Given your performance during this investigation and your documented expertise, you'd be an ideal candidate. As Maria left the Inspector General's trailer that afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The truth had finally emerged. Justice was being served, and her career was not only intact but potentially moving in directions she'd never imagined. But the most satisfying moment came that evening, when word spread through the base that Commander Morrison had been relieved of command and was being transferred pending further investigation. The Marines of Bravo Company gathered in the mess hall, not for any official celebration, but for the kind of informal recognition that occurred when people who'd witnessed injustice finally saw it. A dressed ghost approached Maria with tears in her eyes and a smile that could have powered the entire base. "Staff Sergeant, we never doubted you for a minute. We knew you were right. We knew you were being treated unfairly, and we knew that eventually the truth would come out." Books, in his typically literary way, summarized the situation with characteristic precision. The narrative arc has reached its proper resolution. Justice delayed but not denied, truth emerging despite systematic efforts to suppress it, and the good guys winning in the end. Diesel, as always, cut straight to the practical implications. "So what happens now, Staff Sergeant? You staying with us, or are you moving on to bigger and better things?" Prophet, whose intelligence gathering had been instrumental in revealing the truth, offered his own perspective. "Whatever happens next, everyone on this base now knows that standing up for yourself isn't career suicide. Sometimes it's the only way to survive with your integrity intact." As Maria looked around at the faces of Marines who'd supported her through the most difficult period of her career, she felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with determination. She'd fought for the principle that competence and character mattered more than politics and prejudice, and she'd won. As the sun set over Paris Island, Maria found herself walking the same rifle range where she'd once trained recruits as a gunnery sergeant. The physical range hadn't changed much, but everything else was different. The Marines training there now arrived with different expectations, different confidence levels, and different understanding of what it meant to serve in an institution that valued competence and character above all else. Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps Maria Vasquez stood in the Commandant's office at Headquarters Marine Corps, reviewing the final draft of a new training manual that would institutionalize the lessons learned from 15 years of cultural change within the Corps. The manual, titled Leadership Through Moral Courage, would become required reading for all Marines from recruit training through senior leadership schools. At 52 years old, Maria had reached the pinnacle of enlisted service, becoming only the third woman and the first Hispanic woman to serve as the senior enlisted advisor to the Commandant. Her journey from a young staff sergeant, facing down a hostile commander, to the highest-ranking enlisted Marine in the Corps had become legendary. But more importantly, it had helped transform the institution she loved. The Marine Corps of 2039 bore little resemblance to the organization she'd joined 3 decades earlier. Women now comprised 35% of Marine Corps personnel and held leadership positions at every level. Reports of discrimination had dropped to historic lows, while retention rates and performance metrics had reached all-time highs. Most significantly, the Corps had become genuinely focused on merit-based advancement, creating an environment where excellence was recognized and rewarded regardless of its source. A knock on her office door interrupted Maria's review of the training manual. Her visitor was an unexpected one, retired Gunnery Sergeant Ghost Patterson, now 57 years old and serving as a civilian marksmanship instructor at a shooting academy in North Carolina. "Sergeant Major," Ghost said with a grin that hadn't changed despite the gray in his hair, "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I was in the area for a shooting competition and wanted to stop by." Maria embraced her old squad member with genuine affection. Despite the difference in their ranks, Their shared experience at Camp Leatherneck had created a bond that transcended military hierarchy. Ghost, it's always good to see you. How's civilian life treating you? Can't complain. I'm teaching young people to shoot straight and pass along some of the lessons I learned from the best NCOs in the Marine Corps. Ghost paused, his expression becoming more serious. But I also wanted to thank you for something. Thank me for what? For showing us what real leadership looks like. That morning at Leatherneck, when you stood up to Morrison, you weren't just defending yourself. You were showing all of us that we had the right to demand better from our leaders and the responsibility to be better leaders ourselves. Ghost went on to explain that he'd spent his civilian career working with at-risk youth, using marksmanship training as a way to teach lessons about discipline, respect, and personal responsibility. He'd started a program specifically for young women, many of whom had been told they weren't tough enough or dedicated enough for demanding pursuits. I tell them your story, Sergeant Major. I tell them about the staff sergeant who refused to accept someone else's limitations and proved that excellence is available to anyone willing to work for it. Some of these girls have gone on to military service, others to college, others to successful careers in law enforcement or competitive shooting. But they all learned the same lesson you taught us, that respect is something you earn and sometimes something you take. As Ghost prepared to leave, he handed Maria a photograph that brought tears to her eyes. It showed 12 young women at a shooting competition, each wearing t-shirts with the words "Earned, Not Given" printed across the front. In the center of the group was a teenage girl holding a trophy and wearing a smile that radiated confidence and pride. "That's my daughter," Ghost said quietly. "She's 17 now, headed to the Naval Academy next year with a full scholarship. She's never doubted that she belongs anywhere she's willing to work to be." That confidence came from growing up in a world where your story proved that standing up for yourself makes it easier for others to stand up too. After Ghost left, Maria sat in her office thinking about the ripple effects that continued to flow from that morning at Camp Leatherneck. The confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, the shooting qualification less than an hour, but the consequences had spread through decades and touched thousands of lives. Her grandfather, Miguel, had passed away 2 years earlier at the age of 99, but not before seeing his granddaughter reach the highest levels of Marine Corps leadership. His final words to her had been a reminder of the lesson that started everything. "Mia, you remembered that shooting is not about the gun, it's about respect. And you taught a whole generation of Marines what that really means." As Maria prepared to retire from active duty the following year, she reflected on the legacy she would leave behind. It wasn't the awards, the promotions, or even the policy changes that mattered most. It was the proof that courage was contagious, that standing up for principles could create change, and that sometimes 14 perfect shots could transform. More than just a qualification score, the Marine Corps would continue evolving, facing new challenges and adapting to changing realities. But the fundamental principles that had guided Maria throughout her career, that competence and character mattered more than conformity, that excellence should be recognized regardless of its source, and that moral courage was as important as physical bravery, had become permanently embedded in the institution's culture. On her final day of active duty, Sergeant Major Maria Elena Vasquez returned to Marine Corps Base Quantico for a retirement ceremony that brought together Marines from every phase of her career. The ceremony was held on the same rifle range where she'd first taught the Leadership Under Pressure Course 15 years earlier. As she delivered her farewell address to an audience of 800 Marines, Maria's eyes found the target stands at the 200-yard line, where countless Marines had learned not just marksmanship skills, but lessons about integrity, courage, and the importance of maintaining standards under pressure. "Marines," she concluded, "the most important thing I learned in 31 years of service is that excellence is not a destination, it's a choice you make every day. You choose to maintain your standards when it would be easier to compromise. You choose to stand up for others when it would be safer to remain silent. You choose to fight for your right to be excellent when others try to convince you to settle for less. The ceremony ended with a 21-gun salute that echoed across the same fields, where she'd first proven that sometimes the most important battles were fought not against external enemies, but against the limitations other people tried to impose. As the final echoes faded, Maria smiled at the thought of all the young Marines who would continue carrying forward the lessons learned. On a dusty firing range in Afghanistan, the story that began with 14 shots would continue through every Marine who chose courage over comfort, principle over politics, and excellence over acceptance of mediocrity. Target number 14 at Camp Leatherneck had been replaced countless times over the years, but what it represented had become eternal proof that respect was something you earned and sometimes something you took, that courage was contagious, and that standing up for what's right could change the world one shot at a time. The final score: excellence achieved, principles maintained, legacy secured.